So I don't know if you folks know the site, but let's see here. The site is right across from Great Salt Bay School, and so there's a little parking lot, and it's owned by Department of Conservation. We, Coastal Rivers Conservation Trust, manages this site, and it's a particularly interesting location because it does have this enormous midden on the site, and across the river there is this other midden, which is the Glidden Midden. So I thought I'd talk about a little bit is sort of the history of Wabanaki people, mostly focused on material culture, that is, not the hundreds of years of war between the colonists and the Wabanaki people, but more about how people were living on this landscape, because that's my own personal interest. And that's what I can share by walking on this landscape with you. And then I can try to answer whatever historical questions you have, of course, although that's not my forte. And then I would go down to the Middens from the top of the hill here and kind of show you around. There is another site, like I was saying, right across the river, and I'll later on I'll explain how to get there, because that's a really wonderful site if you are up for a longer walk. The nice thing about this site, in addition to all the other features, but it has now an ADA accessible trail, and only the last little bit out to the Middens is currently not a really easily graded path. So there is this path here from the parking lot, and it's very accessible. From this location, you can see right out to the river. It's actually a little hard to see right where I'm standing because there's plenty of apple trees and things in the way, but it's an amazing spot where you can look down over the river, and I'll take you down the hill a little bit. But it is this amazing trail, and this accessible trail, this easily graded trail is going to actually go. You can take it from Round Top, which is the Round Top Farm, which is the Coastal Rivers headquarters area, which is just through the field here. And then you can come to this area, and eventually this trail in the not too distant future is going to connect all the way to the Great Salt Bay Heritage Farm, or the Great Salt Bay Farm, which is on Belvedere Road. So the trail will actually go underneath Route 1. It'll be wonderful because it'll connect this area across from the school to our education facility over there. So let's just start talking about the site itself and why people would have come here, wherever they might be. I mean, this is first of all, it's this hill that overlooks the estuary. The estuary itself is about 12 miles long. And so from here, you can go up into Great Salt Bay, or you can go down, and today, of course, you'd go under the bridge right in the Newcastle Damariscotta Bridge, but you could take the waterway all the way out to Fort Island and beyond. Today, there's a big apple orchard here, and this field that's been allowed to grow. Oh. Did somebody say something that I missed?
Nope, I don't believe so.
Okay, good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about plant use and how people, and how people would have used plants that are growing here today, that many of them would have grown here in the past as well. So, you know, the first question, of course, is who am I talking about? Who are these Wabanaki people? And what does Wabanaki mean? Wabanaki means the people of the Dawnland, and the name was given because these are the people who lived along the coast here from New Brunswick all the way down to southern New Hampshire. And of course, they still do live here. And the ancestors of the people who I'm talking about, today's Wabanaki people, still live all over. And there are reservations here in Maine where there are larger larger communities of Wabanaki people. So the Wabanaki people have lived here since the last ice age. And when you think about what it would have looked like, what, you know, we're looking at right now, this very lush green environment with tall trees and luscious fruit and all that. But right after the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago, the ice and the ice had scraped all of the topsoil away, and you're left with a lot of gravel, debris, and left with very little for the plants to grow on. And so it was only over thousands of years that first mosses and lichens and algae and fungi could grow here. They decomposed over time and established soil. And as that soil became more and more established, more plants were able to grow here, more diversity, more insects and birds and small mammals and eventually large mammals. And remember the time period we're talking about when I say large mammals, we're talking about megafauna. So there were megafauna, there were mammoths and giant beavers that weighed 500 pounds. There were dire wolves here. And I should say that the height of the ocean was different at different times over the last 12,000 years. And so if any of you have tracked or paid attention to sort of over geologic time, what the height of the ocean was doing, we'll talk about that more later. But that also impacted where people were living. But a lot of the people who were here were presumably, you know, they were foraging on plants and animals. And as those plants and animals changed over time, the material culture of today's Wabanaki people evolved. And today, you can still visit, of course, Wabanaki people's artwork and other skilled material objects that they have made, like birch bark canoes are still being built to some extent, birch bark baskets, ash baskets, things like that. And those are all tied to the environment, of course, and tied to the plants and animals that live here now. But that is the result of the evolution of their culture, which resulted from the evolution that happened on this landscape over time. So that's really why I got into teaching about Wabanaki material culture, is because it helps us understand this landscape, and it helps us understand people's ties to this landscape over time. I'm not Wabanaki. I do now have some Wabanaki friends just because I've taught with a number of Wabanaki people, but I'm personally not Wabanaki. So it may be that some of the people in this audience are Wabanaki, and if they would like to share any of their cultural ties, that would be wonderful. A lot of people don't know if they have Native ancestry, because in all the way up through the 1960s, there was a real push to assimilate people who were or are Native, and for them to lose their culture as they entered families that were not practicing Wabanaki culture. All right, let's talk
Sarah,
about.
we do have a question really quick.
Yes,
can you distinguish between the Wabanaki peoples and the Abenaki peoples?
Oh, good question. So the word Abenaki means the same thing. It means people of the Dawnland. And there is a tribe of Abenaki people who are now predominantly in southern New Hampshire and a little bit into Vermont as well. And so in the early 1600s, there was a confederacy formed of the tribes that lived in Maine at the time, which were the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Micmac, and the Maliseet. And there's some there's not certainty as to whether officially the Abenaki people were represented in that confederacy that was formed. The confederacy was formed in order to organize against European pressure, but there was no written language of any of the Wabanaki cultures until very recently. And so there is no written record because there were no Europeans present at that meeting, or maybe it was a series of meetings, I don't know. But when the Confederacy was formed, we don't know, in fact, is the answer as to whether Abenaki tribal leadership was within the Wabanaki culture, Wabanaki Confederacy.
Sarah, can I interrupt you?
Yes.
This is Jerry Homer. So that whole thing is pretty controversial. And for anybody who is interested in exploring the controversy, I would recommend Harold, he goes by Skip Brock's book on Norumbega and the Wawanok people.
Right.
He would argue, which I think persuasively, but there's certainly differences of opinion, that the Confederacy you referred to was organized by we'll use the white man's term, chief, from right around here in the Booth Bay, Damariscotta area was his primary seat, supposedly. And he organized the Confederacy that reached from basically the western side of Penobscot Bay, let's call it Camden Hills, west, maybe including New Hampshire, and that Confederacy was primarily organized to oppose the eastern Abenakis, the Penobscots, and so on. He was ultimately killed in warfare around 1617. And of course, as always, the victors get to write the history. So some of what we now have as history comes from the Penobscot people who actually did not exist at the time. The Penobscot people only developed as a separate group around 1620. But it's a lot to look into, very controversial. I think the other thing is this whole question is a white man's question. Who were the people who were living here? What did they call themselves? What was their territory? They probably referred to themselves as people, and they lived here. They did not have quite the same concept that the Europeans and we have about territory and so on. So it's an interesting question.
It absolutely is. And I appreciate you bringing up that book in particular as a good resource. That's great. It's hard to find. So if anyone's looking for it after the fact and wants the bibliography, you should email me and I can get it to you. That's helpful. Thank you for setting more context in that regard.
If we get through this pandemic sometime, we're trying to organize a author talk at the Booth Bay Harbor Library. It was originally planned for July, which of course is now indefinitely postponed, but we're hoping to get Mr. Brack and ideally some of the people from the other side of the argument to have a scholarly discussion on the question.
That sounds interesting. That's great. All right, I've got ospreys overhead calling, which you probably can't hear on the phone, and crows here and there. And I'm in this field, which is right now, we've got milkweed here, and I'm actually going to turn my phone around so I can show you something. So I apologize if that is awkward. But let me turn my phone so that you can. The reason I want to there we go. This is milkweed here. And probably a lot of you have become familiar with milkweed as a youngster, maybe playing with the seeds and watching the little parachutes fly in the wind. When these plants first come up in the spring, they look a little bit like asparagus. There are some lookalikes that are toxic, but if you can recognize milkweed for what it is, in the spring, it's a good early green to eat. In addition, in July, when the flowers are blooming, these of course are past, but the flowers are edible, and the seed pods, when they're about the size of your thumbnail, are also edible. And they taste a little bit like summer squash. In the fall, the milkweeds will dry, and the stems can be, you break them and then rub the fibers between the palms of your hands, and the fibers will become loose, and then you can actually twine them. And this is a common twining material. People living here needed twine, of course, in order to tie things together. So whether it's the moccasin on your foot or the flap on your wigwam, whatever it might be. All right. Of course, we have a lot of non-natives or things that have come into this field since that time, since early contact with colonists. This is spotted knapweed. It's a recent invasive, pretty common in this field, unfortunately. Timothy, the grass, was also brought by early colonists. So now we're going to walk kind of down this way. But what's remarkable about some of these sites is really, the reason why I want to dwell on kind of food sources is that, of course, the people living here along the banks of the estuary, they needed to eat oysters, of course, which we're going to get to, but they also needed other things to eat. And so that's one of the things that I want to just kind of talk about as we walk. The apple trees would have been post-contact. Those are not a native plant. And interestingly, actually, Queen Anne's lace, people aren't familiar with that, but it also is a more recent invader. It's actually a wild carrot, so the root can be eaten, but it's not a native plant here. This is baneberry or dog baneberry, spreading baneberry. It also actually has a fibrous stalk that can be twined. And then we have a lot of wild parsnip, which is a recent and very unwelcome invader in my book. Here we have a little bit of wild grape. So grape leaves are edible. It's a little hard to grab here, but the grapes themselves, of course, are edible in the late summer, and the little tendrils. Let's see if I can find one like this. Actually, I don't know if that's visible there where my finger is. This is actually a tendril. It's the end of the vine. It's curled around this other plant, and the tendril is very lemony. So I eat them actually as a lemon flavoring on seafood. As you can imagine, that people needed to make shelter, of course, they needed water, and they needed food. And this environment is extremely rich in a lot of ways. This plant here is actually, it's not a particularly easy specimen to look at maybe, but this is a vine. This is the groundnut vine. And if you follow this vine into the dirt, dig it up a little bit, there's a golf ball sized starch-filled tuber, and that's an excellent form of starch for eating through the fall and into the early winter, as long as you can dig it out. So I'm just gonna continue walking down. So I'm now walking on the grassy path here. It takes down the hill towards the river. And I'm actually getting close to the midden, which is what you all are wanting to. Have a number of you seen the Midden already in person, or are some of you looking to visit it in the near future?
We've seen it.
I've been there.
Yep, great. So the Midden was established, we believe, about, starting around 3,000 years ago up until about 1,500 years ago. And the reason for the timing is probably related to that's when the oysters in this area became really plentiful. What happened was there was some isostatic rebounding after the glacier receded, and this portion of the estuary, the upper part, rebounded higher and more than the lower part. And it's at Johnny Orr Rapids, which is just below us here in the estuary, you can see where this part of the river is higher, and now there's that rapids there. And so the conditions were right in terms of a shallower, warmer environment with a good supply of oyster seed, and so oysters could establish themselves in big reefs here, and people came to harvest them. And there's been quite a bit of really good documentation about people coming to this area and not just harvesting oysters, but like I was pointing out, some of the other sources of food and materials that would be available here. It's a very rich area. One advantage, of course, to oysters in particular is it's a great source of protein. Some of us like them, some of us don't, but at any rate, it's a great source of protein that doesn't run away, unlike a moose. And so, once you know that it's here, it doesn't go anywhere unless something dramatic happens, and that makes for a very desirable thing when you're a culture that's looking for food on the landscape. So as I'm walking down the trail here, I do see shells of oysters just in the dirt where the grass has been scuffed up a bit. And now I'm right above the river, and I'm going to take, there are a couple of interpretive signs here, and I'm going to take a right at the base of the hill and head into the woods a bit more so that I can take you right to the top of the Midden. So here you can see the pathway is strewn with these shells. This is an archaeological site, so we take every caution not to disturb it and not to impact it. And so there's a platform here with some interpretive signage where you can look down into this area here, which is where you can kind of look into the old part of the Midden. So the Midden here was probably a good 20 feet deep and extended back into the woods. I'll kind of show you about 400 feet. But starting at the time when initially when the fort at Pemaquid was built, and then much later on in the 1880s, there was a lot of excavation of the shells, and it was initially used as lime in the building of the fort, and then later the colonists here were using these both as fertilizer on fields and to feed chickens to harden the shells. I still use oyster shells for my chickens, but I use modern shells, not these ones. But I'm going to show you here a little bit. You can get kind of an idea. There's a cutaway of this bank where it's just solid shells heaped upon each other, and it goes along like that for quite a ways. So there's vegetation on top now, but underneath it's still meters deep of oyster shells.
Sarah, maybe everybody already knows, but midden is basically a fancy archaeological term for a garbage dump or trash heap. So it's the shells that were just piled up after being harvested.
That's correct. There is some work now being done to look at, so the location of this shell heap, this garbage pit, and also its contents has sparked some interest among archaeologists today who are wondering, this shell heap is actually a little different in that, and the one across the way, Glidden, also, is in that they don't and haven't contained many other archaeological tools. You might expect that a midden, you know, over time would get a spear point in it that was maybe broken and it would get cast off, or you know, some bones from an animal might get thrown in. And there have been findings in this midden. There was an excavation done by an archaeologist during the early colonial period, during the mid 1880s, but by and large, there haven't been a lot of artifacts found here. And so today there's some question as to, well, why might that be? And when we get down to the river in a minute, we can talk about this more. But one theory is, and it is just a theory at this point, is that, well, maybe there was some spiritual or other significance to these large, I mean, these are really significant heaps of shells. We do have small middens the length of this estuary and all throughout the region, and in fact all throughout, you know, North America's coastal areas. There are middens from Native people in many places, but the difference here could be partly the lack of artifacts, and then in addition, there are the location of the other middens along the estuary are very frequently, almost exclusively, with one exception that I know of, on little points of land that stick into the estuary. And of course, they often have sheltered areas associated with them where people might be able to live. Excuse me. And then they also have, you know, this one is particularly large, and so, you know, there's this supposition that, you know, well, what would that look like if we were coming down the estuary 1,000 years ago, well, you know, or 500 years ago, and maybe if you had white markers in the form of these hills, these trash heaps that stuck out into the estuary, you know, maybe there was some kind of waypoints of sorts that were being used by people as gathering points. And so, in fact, so here I am right on top of Whaleback Midden, and I'm looking out over the estuary, and that hill that you see across from me, I'll try, it's right in the sun, of course, but can you see the white hill across the river from me?
I can.
Yeah, that's Glidden Midden, and it's quite large. It was excavated less. Unfortunately, Route 1 goes right across this area, and so there is a possibility that there was archaeological disturbance when Route 1 was put in. There's another midden from where I'm standing. If I look up on the other side of Route 1, I can see there's a house over there. It's actually down the hill from the house and from where I am to the right. And I can see it. It's actually to the left of the rightmost post for the bridge. There's another midden over there. And there's another midden. It's quite a bit smaller on the spit of land that we call Blackstone Point, that sticks into the estuary into Great Salt Bay. And so, the archaeologists are questioning a little bit about, what would that have looked like, and what kind of additional meaning or purpose might have had some of these midden sites, some of these trash heaps or shell heaps. And in fact, Dr. Alice Kelly, who's affiliated with the University of Maine Climate Institute, is currently working on a video to show us what they think both the vegetation, sea level, and the heaps themselves might have looked like. And I don't know exactly what the time period is she's working with, but if it's 500 or 1,000 years ago, I'm not sure. So there's Whaleback, I'm sorry, Glidden across the way.
Sarah, have you heard, I guess it's a theory or a hypothesis, that trying to explain the enormous size of these middens, that this was more than a subsistence deal, that this might have been a commercial operation. In effect, that the local people were harvesting these oysters, smoking them, and then trading them.
I actually haven't read anything along those lines, so I would be interested to, but on some level it certainly makes sense. It's a very large heap, both sides of the river, and what I have heard more about in terms of literature that I've read is more about the aspects of this location as a meeting area, and that people would have come here specifically because there was so much resource available in the way of food and perhaps other materials as well, and they would have been able to come to some agreement about whatever other disagreements they might have had at the time, and been able to share resources here. And so there's quite a bit of literature now that discusses that possibility, and that's an interesting concept. And in fact, a very readable book by Carrie Hardy mentions that, along with another other related topics. But Notes on a Lost Flute is a wonderful book that he has written, that you might check out. And it's generally about some of these things that I'm talking about, some of this material culture. And he talks more widely about areas in Penobscot Bay down to Brunswick area and so forth. But it's a good book. So here we are at the estuary, and certainly right now you can see the waters flowing under the Route 1 bridge. Tide's coming back in. This river, you can tell just by looking at where the tidal marks are, but this is getting emptier, and I don't know if you can really tell, but this would have been the area where there would have been oyster reefs. There are no longer oyster reefs here, and that is another question that we don't fully understand. There has been some research about it. Dan Belknap is one at the University of Maine who's done some work on this. Certainly, there is, his theory is, and it makes sense, it's certainly possible that oyster drills became more prevalent as the climate continued to warm, and so they may have really had a big impact on the oysters themselves. They're a small snail-like animal, but they're a carnivore, and they drill into bivalves and eat them. And then and so they may not have been gone from this area, but native people were not harvesting in the same quantities after about 1,500 years ago. And then when the colonists came the fact that they were harvesting all of the vegetation, the trees and so forth off the lands around the estuary meant that there was a huge amount of silt that ended up in the estuary and also specifically in the Great Salt Bay. And that may have done the oysters in for good and for the time being, because what happened was they got smothered by that sawdust from the mills. There were mills on every single little stream. Excuse me. And so the combination of the sawdust and the silt would have done in the oysters at that point. The only reason we have oysters probably now, there may have been some wild oysters that were left, but for the most part, the oysters that you see harvested in the estuary are probably related to the farmed oysters off the aquaculture sites. And starting in the early 1970s, there was aquaculture here, first for European oysters, and then later on, well, first they did finfish, that failed. Then they tried European oysters, that failed. And then they tried Eastern oysters, and that succeeded. And that is what you see being grown today all over the estuary. And in fact, if I bring you back this way a little bit, you'll be able to see this is Johns River Oyster Farm is through the trees there, right along the shore here. Does anybody have any other questions about this part of the site? I'm going to walk us back the way we came and then along the river a little bit if there's no other questions specifically about this location. Okay. Well, if you haven't been here, I do recommend it. It's pretty extraordinary. And if you would like to visit the Glidden Midden, the best way to do that is to park across from Lincoln County News and follow the trail that goes from across the road, across from the Lincoln County News parking lot. And it follows the bay, and then you go under Route 1 in an old sheep tunnel, which is pretty entertaining, but it can be quite wet in there. And then you're right at the Midden once you've done that. It's about a mile out, I believe. And then to make the loop to come back is about I think it's about a 3-mile loop. So you can come back on that side of Route 1, on the Glidden side, and then cross the road on foot back at the near Lincoln County News, right on the entrance ramp. So,
Sarah, can you maybe talk a little bit about opportunities for further information or like midden minders in the future when the world is back to normal?
Thank you. Yeah. So we have a program called Midden Minders, which is actually a volunteer monitoring program where we are trying to document changes over time to the middens. We're starting with the middens that Coastal Rivers maintains, or the properties that are maintained by Coastal Rivers. So we have several middens at, for example, the Salt Bay Heritage Farm, and we also have middens down on Plumber Point. I was actually there today. One of the concerns is that the middens are being lost because of climate change as the sea level rises and as we have more and more storm impact. We are seeing that we're losing these archaeological sites and the potential to learn from them, and also the cultural significance to the Wabanaki people. And so Dr. Alice Kelly and the state archaeologist, Dr. Art Spies, some other folks have initiated, it's actually a statewide program, and we're kind of one of the satellites. And so our volunteers are going out and they're measuring on an annual basis these sites. And then we're also doing more regular photography of these sites. We try to do it at least once a month during good weather season, but at least getting some photography with scale, so that we can learn a little bit about what is. We know that the sites are all being impacted by erosion, but the degree to which this is happening is a little hard to document without data. So that's where we're starting. So if people would like to be involved, I have more need of volunteers, and I actually, you know, it's something we can do during COVID times, because I can train people from 6 feet away, and especially works well. It is something you need to do with a family member, because it helps to have a partner to do it, but it's certainly doable if you have a family member or somebody who's in your COVID bubble, who can participate in all that. So here we are at the base of the hill, a little further down the trail. There are some stone steps that can take you, I'm not actually going to go all the way down, but they take you down to the river, and it's right across from the Glidden Midden. Quite an impressive site, I think. Really, it's the original working waterfront here, especially if what you say is true, and it was actually a form of commerce, which, you know, it's possible for sure. Native people all over this continent traded for a wide variety of things. There have been arrowheads found here that were from Texas and further away. So yeah, what other questions do people have? I'm gonna kind of wander up the hill, but
Where did you start your walk from?
I was just below the parking lot that is right off of Business Route 1 in Damariscotta, across from Great Salt Bay School.
Across from what school?
It's called Great Salt Bay School, which is
Okay.
the Damariscotta Elementary School.
And there's a trail right there to go in.
There certainly is, yep. And you just head down the hill, and then when you get to the bottom of the hill, it's about a 5-minute walk when you're not talking to your phone like I am. When you head to the bottom of the hill, just bear right and duck into the trees. You'll see there's a couple of interpretive signs there. And just head towards the river, and you'll be right up where I was.
Okay.
Yeah.
There is a pretty big sign right up on Business Route 1 for Whaleback Shell Midden Historical Site, and the parking lot right there.
It's true. It's a big sign, but it's gray because it's for the Department of Conservation. And so I can see why sometimes people miss it. But if you are going north on Business Route 1, like you've been through Damariscotta and you're going north, if you get back to Route 1, you've gone too far. And if you go south and you get towards Hannaford's, you've gone too far.
Sarah,
Yeah.
you mentioned seeing middens even on Plummer Point, and right along it, there's a trail that runs, in fact, along, I guess it's along the eastment of Plummer Point, but in that conservation area that I have watched for years, that has little, broken up oyster shells always there.
Yeah.
And I have always assumed that it was some kind of midden. Now, how can one know without digging it up, which would not be good for the trail?
Right. Good question, Polly.
What can you say about that?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, if there's an eroded bank and you look into it, you can often tell that, there's stuff coming out of it over time. And it's usually fairly clear. I suspect, Polly, I don't know where you're talking about exactly, but I know where there's a midden at Plummer Point. There is one. It's actually in that part of the river. It's not oysters, it's clams. So
Not oysters, the ones I'm thinking of.
oh really? Okay, well then
I'm
we should check
pretty
that out.
sure.
We should find out if that's
We'll see. Yeah.
we'll find out. But yeah, I mean the official way to look into the ground without digging it up is to hire scientists excuse me, who have access to LiDAR. So LiDAR is like a little like radar, kind of, and it can from the air bounce signals into the ground, and they can identify what kind of substrate they're looking at. And so you can see differences in the LiDAR for whether or not there's a midden there or not.
I'd like to show you this sometime, but also one that's much easier to see that's also on a trail, but it's on the land that it's land that belongs to oh dear, what's their name? It's on Great Salt Bay. It's very close to the Belvedere headquarters.
Yeah. Are you thinking of the folks who have owned pools in the past?
These are the folks who gave put a part of their property into easement to the DRA then. And when you get to the end of the trail there, you're looking at an amazing cross section of layers and layers of oysters.
That's the general area that when you look under Route 1 from here, that's what I was looking at over there. Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I spent a whole afternoon there with Dr. Alice Kelly looking at that site fairly recently.
Good.
Yep.
I don't mean to be a smart aleck, but I one time asked the state archaeologist how to tell an artifact from a rock. And he said, well, once you've seen one, you'll know it. So I would suggest if you go to Whaleback Midden and go down where Sarah started, right by the interpretive sign, there's a little gully. Get down, you can get down close and look at it. Once you've seen a midden, you will recognize it all up and down the Damariscotta on both sides of the river. And I have no doubt that what you're looking at is a midden.
Yeah, I would agree that it is most likely a midden. I mean, if it's shells scattered and they look old and broken, and it's not a place where gulls are currently breaking shells, then it's a midden.
And the old middens, the shells are very small pieces, may not obviously be a shell. It's white speckles, but a lot of them. Almost looks like vermiculite in your planting soil.
Yeah, that's a good comparison, exactly.
But
Yeah.
if it has little sharp edges and angles, as if you took a hammer and smashed an oyster shell to bits, it wouldn't look like vermiculite. It would look like little pieces of shell. I mean,
Yeah, no, it would be flat. The pieces are all flat because the way the oyster lays, or the clam for that matter, lays them on, they're flat. So when they get crushed over time,
I guess
little slivered.
I'm just arguing for my Plummer Point middens being a middens, and maybe it isn't.
No, I suspect it is. You know, Polly, I was just at Plummer Point this morning, documenting the midden that I know about, but maybe you're talking about one that I don't know about. So I'll send you a map of the one that I know about, and you can confirm for me if it's the one you think it is.
We'll talk about it.
That sounds good.
If the shells are big enough chunks that they can clearly be identified still as shells, it may be much more recent than the one we're looking at here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yep.
interesting that when I bought my house in South Bristol, I was putting in a garden, and I put some, started to dig for some plants, and this whole bank of my backyard is all shells. It's 3 to 4 feet deep. And I thought, it's a little far from the river, so I can't imagine why someone would drag oysters and everything all the way up here and then throw them away. But it's clearly a midden. It's just not how old it is a good question.
Well, yeah, I don't know. If you'd like to learn more about it, you could always drop an email to either me or Dr. Alice Kelly. I would probably send it on to her, and she and Artspeace have documented the middens around here, so she could tell you if it's one they know about or if it's something they haven't seen before, if they know about it. She would be much more able to tell you kind of how it fits into the larger landscape than I could.
I'm pretty sure this house was on this lot originally was more than 100 years old. So I suspect somebody sat in the backyard there and just pitched shells and eventually built up a pile. And over the years, that's ended up being exactly how a middens form. But it is kind of interesting because I was surprised to see how many shells there were. Anyway, didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah. Huh. Well, that's about all I had prepared for you folks today. So thank you very much for joining us. And, if more questions come up about this or other related topics, be sure and reach out to us at Coastal Rivers. It was great having you, and I appreciate the questions and the ideas that came up in the conversation. So thank you for participating, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very
Sarah.
much.
Wow, my pleasure. Take care, everyone.